My name is Derek Sutherland, for those who don't know me. I am the chief architect for Shadowsoft. I've been working here for close to 11 years. I've used OpenShift for about 12 years prior to it being Kubernetes based, and have a large background in software development, cybersecurity, and then automation across different cloud providers from a very DevOps heavy perspective. So, like Ansible, Terraform, configuration management tools of the past, like Chef, Puppet, kind of a monitoring background with APM. So, that's me in a nutshell. I oversee our customer engagements, and I'm in the weeds doing lots of architecture and design stuff for different customers. So, that's me in a nutshell. With me is Christian, my friend from Red Hat. Christian, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Derek. Appreciate it. Christian Trujillo here. I am with Red Hat. I've been with Red Hat for over 5 years now. And prior to Red Hat, I was doing all kinds of different stuff, right? I started in my career as a help desk guy and then sysadmin. I did a lot of project delivery as well, maintained some big, large enterprises with VMware. I was VMware certified and all that, right? So my background was heavy on infrastructure, some automation as well there. And then when I joined Red Hats, I started to, back in Southern California. Now I'm in the beautiful Tennessee area here, close to Nashville. So just very happy to be here with you, Derek. Looking forward to this
Yeah,
conversation.
man. It's gonna be fun. So, first thing I want to talk about, obviously, is why. So, what's this webinar even for? We obviously said it's a masterclass in building a virtualization strategy, right? But why are we talking about it? Addressing the elephant in the room. Obviously, everyone's talking about the Broadcom acquisition and what happened. Even still, it's been months now. This has been going on, and it's not becoming a smaller problem. It's becoming even a bigger problem as they're making more and more licensing changes, and customers are curious. Curious from your perspective on the Red Hat side, what are you guys seeing day to day in terms of customers? Like, are people just jumping in and going, I need something different? And I'm looking at OpenShift, or are they kind of like testing their toe in the water? For us, it's a little bit of testing their toe. There's some that are full board, but I want to know, like, are you experiencing the same kind of thing from your perspective?
Yeah, it's very interesting because when you look at what's happening with customers, customers knew they needed to transform. They knew they were running, the same infrastructure, workloads on the same infrastructure for a long time. And they knew they had to modernize eventually, right? They thought they had a long more time, right? A lot more time to do that. But I think the recent acquisition is speeding that up a lot for a lot of our customers. Our customers are now starting to be really concerned about, okay, what are all our alternatives, right? How can we really modernize our workloads? And so they are really, some of them are struggling. Some are struggling because they may not know how to do it, right? And they see the competition doing it, right? They see their competitors already modernizing, right? Already transforming that infrastructure. And so it's interesting what's happening right now. There's a lot of uncertainties from many of our customers and a lot of concerns as well.
Yeah, we're definitely hearing people that are concerned from our perspective, but the concern seems to waver, right? It depends on what side of the spectrum they're on. They're either looking at it from a cost perspective, which obviously most, I say, start there. And now some of them, I think what we're seeing more is they're getting afraid that if they don't do something different, they're going to be left behind. Is that kind of what you're following as well? Like, when I mean that very specifically, because this is kind of like a golden opportunity of like everyone's looking at this. So if you ever were going to consider containerization, it's good to go now is kind of the thought that we've been hearing. And the customers that aren't moving are like, hey, we were originally doing this for cost, but maybe we should be looking at the bigger picture. I mean, are you kind of seeing the same thing, or does it look different for you?
Yeah, so there's two main things. One is the cost perspective, right? And the other one is the feeling of being left behind. You hit it right on point there. I think as we heard digital transformation, right? We hear that a lot. And I think that explains a lot of what's happening with many companies. The way customers are now interacting with the business is very different. It's very modern, right? It's very modernized.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
That happened to me. I am, interacting with AT&T, with airlines on a chat, right? And or even social media, right? So the way customers are interacting is bringing a lot of demand for modernization from the customer perspective. So the customers are not modernizing,
Right.
are feeling left behind. I feeling like, okay, I'm not containerizing my workloads, which slows down the way how fast I'm delivering products to my customers, how fast I'm modernizing this application that I have, because now I'm running this application in very heavy, way, right? That is not scalable. And so there is that also concern of if I'm not modernizing, if I'm not modernizing my infrastructure, I'm gonna be left behind. And how am I gonna compete, right? If I'm not running this type of processes.
Right. So, but do you feel like it's enough of a push for most people that like is it one of those things like it's an afterthought? Hey, we're worried about this too, but it's not as big of a deal. Or are you kind of 'cause like it really depends. Some of my customers are like, we're worried about this, but not quite as much because probably people aren't going to really take it seriously either. Or there's other customers that are like genuinely afraid that like, hey, the industry we're in is highly competitive and this is the thing we're worried about. Are you kind of seeing that mixed bag reaction? Is it really at forefront for you guys about the transformative side, or is it more like kind of like a secondary thought? Is more what I was getting at.
It used to be a secondary thought. It used to
Okay.
be when they knew they had more time to do it. The recent acquisition is now the reason why the recent acquisition is speeding that up is because they're concerned about the cost. Now they're gonna have to
Yeah.
a lot more money. So now they're starting to think about alternatives. So
Right.
what would be my alternative? Would it be just paying more and staying with the same or something else? Right. And
Sure.
I think that before it used to be in the back of the mind, we know we need to get there. We'll get there eventually, little by little, maybe one app, maybe another app, but now is a real concern, I think,
Right.
because they're looking for alternatives, right? They're looking for what's my alternative to run these workloads. And a lot of our customers may not be ready to fully modernize, and that's okay too. But I think
Right.
that the reason why they're looking at alternative is that an alternative that's going to set them up for the future, for that time when they're ready to modernize.
Sure, that makes sense. So, like, the other thing that we frequently run into when we're talking about this is directionality, right? So, I think initially customers are like, let's just go for something that's equivalent. So, this is where like not again, I'm not going to say Proxmox, but like Hyper-V, maybe Proxmox in some instances, something that feels like a VM platform comes up and customers start looking at OpenShift and they're like, well, this is way different.
Hmm.
And it's not that we get pushback, but we get like this initial reaction of like, why do it differently?
Yeah.
And for my perspective, I think there's good reason. But what's your rationale when you think about it? When you start talking to customers, are you telling them like the differences, or it's not just the benefits? It's that it's like kind of reinventing the wheel of what your future is going to be like. What's the conversations you're having?
I understand what you're saying, and if I put myself in their shoes, right? So if I was managing, like I used to be, right before I joined Red Hat, so managing big clusters of VMware, right? And I'm used to that. I was VCP certified. I have a long history of learning that technology and managing that technology. So from the sysadmin perspective, it can be scary to look at something new, something different. But also, if I look at my career, if I want to progress and advance my career, I would want to learn something new and fresh and relevant that's going to be setting me up for the future, because I know I'm well aware that containers are going to be the future. That's where everything is going to eventually go. So if I can take advantage of the opportunity that I have now to learn that, I would take it. Not everybody is like that. Not everybody's ready to fully go, in that route. The beauty of
Sure.
what we're doing right now at Red Hat is that before we used to have, a full, OpenShift virtualization, right? Which was for containers and for virtualization all together. And you're pretty aware because we just did
Sure.
something
Yeah.
together about the OVE, right? The OpenShift virtualization
Yeah.
engine. The focus is just on the virtualization piece, and now is a way for customers to start their migration, their journey into a virtual like what they've been using in the past, but now on OpenShift, that is a platform that's ready for the future. Now, yes, customers are looking for alternatives that are similar to what they're running. But I think what we've been able to help them understand is that you're running a technology that has been the same way for a long time, that hasn't really modernized, right? So I think looking at a way to modernize the infrastructure as well in a platform that is future proof will give you an advantage rather than going to something that is the same, right? Is the same
Sure.
virtualization technology to another platform that is the same virtualization technology. With OpenShift, it gives you that opportunity to be ahead of the curve, right? Because now you are in a platform that you're still running virtual workloads, but it sets you up for the future when you're ready to containerize.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the same like pitch that I go through, so I definitely resonate with that. This is where it gets curious for me though. Do you see it different for different verticals? Like, do you see that like in finance, it's like really growing and exploding, or like in e-commerce? Like, is there particular verticals where you're seeing more of this start to change, or do you think it's kind of it's not really a vertical alignment, it's more of a technology problem alignment? Sometimes it could be both, but I'm just curious. For this is like genuinely, what are you seeing on a day basis, you know?
Yeah. So, for example, in the government side, right? And the government's always slower, right, to
Sure.
adopt new technologies. But they're also very conscious with costs. And so I think when the increase in cost came about, they started to really rethink their strategy. So that was
Oh
to
yeah.
an eye opener, to see the opportunity that we have to be able to help them modernize those workloads, because now they're very concerned with the costs that are going to come with staying in the same type of infrastructure. But also, I think the main drivers are those who are really wanting to stay ahead of the curve. Like I've seen those, right? I mean, the banks are always trying to also reduce costs, but also want to provide better services to their customers, right? Telco, we see that in telco as a lot as well. But if, to me, the eye opener was the government, right? Trying to really now rethink about modernization in a faster way, which was not really something they were interested in as much in the past, or in that speed, of
Right.
modernization.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the why we're having this conversation, the different areas where it makes sense and whatnot. Let's change the focus of the conversation to really it's kind of still a why, but it's really focused on the OpenShift vert aspect of things in terms of like the what, right? So a lot of customers are looking at OpenShift vert now, for the big reason that we both kind of highlighted on, which is to do things differently. OpenShift, from my perspective, is a software-defined data center. That's what it is, right? You're getting all the capabilities of Kubernetes and OpenShift, but for VMs. Why? Because VMs in OpenShift live in a pod. So software-defined networking, software-defined storage, service discovery, all those new components that maybe you weren't doing in a traditional VM world now become not just possible, but they're like at the tip of your finger as something you can utilize. Do you feel like customers that are starting to go down this rabbit hole, in your perspective or what you're experiencing, are they adopting those different technology sets, or are they just kind of trying to paint what they're doing for virtualization today into OpenShift, if that makes
Hmm.
sense?
That's a really good question. I think that it comes back to going back to when I was a sysadmin and putting myself in their shoes, right? And they have been running a VM in a traditional way, and then containers is a different technology, right? Is a
Sure.
different way, a different architecture, different way, even to understand it. It took me a little bit to understand containers.
Sure.
I came to Red Hat, and they were telling me, okay, so containers, Kubernetes. I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't understand
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, for
I was
sure.
trying to put it together with the VMs and the containers, but like you mentioned, so now a VM still running as a container within OpenShift. So I think it takes a little bit of a learning curve to be able to comprehend. But what I notice is that once they get it, they see why. They see the why is and the why of of this technology. Why of using a container versus the traditional way we're running VMs. A lot faster, you can move them around, you have the same experience, so on and so forth. Deploy multiple much faster. I mean, there's so many benefits to it, but I think once they fully understand that, they come around. Now,
For sure.
I think it's important to have some sort of help during that process, and that can be from Shadowsoft, or the training, or just really watching even YouTube videos to understand, right? That will just really help you understand the what's and how is it that is going to work. But that's my perspective on that.
No, that makes sense. So what I think is interesting though is that I feel like, and this is just from what I've experienced recently, especially, fear becomes a blocker a lot of the times for
Mm,
how different it is. And I don't mean for adopting the technology, but like for changing their process. So people come into OpenShift, and again, you have all these software defined things, and they're so used to, well, I have the operations team doing the virtualization layer of things, but I have a network ops team, I have a security team, I have all these different groups that are managing these different things because they're not software defined right now. So, how do I still give them the decision making power around these things? Like, how do I inject change control management into this? authorizing who can do what without imposing or limiting the ability for all that automation to exist, right? How do I keep not these people in their functional roles, but how do I make sure that I have the right people looking at the right things while still allowing things to be automated, if that makes sense? So from my perspective, I feel like, and this is going into that what region of what is OpenShift Vert and how is it really done different? OpenShift Vert gives you the ability to software define everything, but the first barrier of entry for that is your willingness to accept that and then organizationally adopt those functions, right? And set up the right boundaries of who's going to do change control for security, who's going to do it for networking, how are we going to implement that change control? And a lot of times that's with GitOps, right? So this is where people that have been using containers for a long time make this journey real easy. So I've walked into some customers, and I don't know if you've seen this too. I've walked into some customers that are OpenShift shops, and they have a very easy time going to OpenShift Vert because they're like, well, we're already doing GitOps for containers, and we
Mm.
understand why you would do it. We're already doing software-defined networking and monitoring. We understand how this works, at least a high enough level perspective that we can manage it. Whereas those people adopting OpenShift Vert have an easy time going, now we're just going to do it for everything. And that makes our lives so much easier. The people that are not in containers at all yet, they have a longer journey ahead of them because there's a bigger learning curve. Are you
Mhm.
seeing customers on both sides? And I don't just mean, are you seeing them have these same struggles, but are you seeing customers that are non-containerized shops adopt OpenShift Vert and do it like full bear where they're getting in the weeds with it? I don't know if you're running into that too.
It's a much lower adoption, I think, and you're so completely right. I think those who have been learning the container world and maybe adding it to their processes here and there and understanding it, they tend to embrace it a lot more, right? Because they understand all the benefits of it. But those who have not, it takes a lot of work, right? Training, keeping up with the skills, a little bit of hand holding to be able to help them. But once they get it, it'll be easier. But I'm curious, I'm gonna ask you a question.
Go, go, go.
From your perspective, who's driving this transformation? Have you seen the leadership at each of these organizations driving the
Yeah,
transformation, or
it's an interesting question because it can go either way. So we a lot of times will walk into an organization, and if they were not a vert shop for not an OpenShift shop, excuse me, they were completely a VMware shop or whatever, then it's usually coming top down. We
uh,
have to get off Broadcom, and so we need to figure out how we're going to do that. And the likelihood is we're going to something different. And oh, look, Red Hat has something. Let's look at this other picture. The companies that have at least some either Red Hat portfolio or they have a container strategy, that's more at a director level. Yes, there's a top down pressure because they're like, Broadcom's expensive. We need to get off of this. But there's more of a native conversation. We're like, well, we're already doing this and we know Red Hat has this. So maybe we should go start thinking about how we can do virtualization as well. Then it becomes more, cross organic. And that does affect how they are willing to adopt it because it feels less pressured. It feels more like organically this makes sense for us, especially when they think about excuse me, tool creep.
mm,
So and I'll set the stage for this, and this gets starting to get into the how for a lot of these things. When you go down the rabbit hole of thinking about what I'm doing in VMware versus what I would do in OpenShift Vert, the first thing people don't think about talking about is how they're managing VMware versus how they would manage OpenShift. I don't mean the knowledge, the administrative skill set. I mean the tooling. If you're a Terraform shop and that's the way you do everything in VMware, not that you can't do Terraform things inside of OpenShift because there is a provider for Kubernetes, but most people manage things through GitOps using Helm in OpenShift, right? So there's a tool difference. And the people that have been doing containers for a long time or even for a couple of years, they're already doing this. And so right now they're maintaining two different tool stacks.
mm,
And for them, they're going, OpenShift Vert can make us go down to one tool set stack where
right.
we're not having to do two different things. So that becomes an immediate advantage value buy-in. Whereas somebody who's on the VMware path and they're not a containerized shop is not only introducing new ways of doing Vert, but they're also thinking about how are we going to tool for this, which if their long-term goal is we want to do containers too, boom, this marries right up to where they're going. If they haven't thought about a container strategy, those are the people that are more apprehensive because they're like, once they realize this, there's a lot more nuance here. in terms of day-to-day operations. So anyways, that was a long-winded way of answering your
Oh
question, but
no, that's
that's the way I
great.
would look at
That's great. I don't know. Do you want to bring up maybe Raymond? Because Raymond had a
it.
question or a comment there.
Yeah, Raymond. So when we got started, I said, guys, we're going to hold questions for a while. If you guys have a question and you want to raise your hand and you want to jump in or you have a comment you want to make, raise your hand and we'll let you guys come in and just add color commentary. We're totally cool with that. I did see you put a comment up earlier and so did Christian. Raymond, did you have something that you wanted to add or was that particular to something we were talking about before? And you can come off mute. I think, Raymond, you have control over your mute right now. Okay, cool. Got it. Just a comment. Great. All right. So continuing on from that, we want to start digging into now, like, okay, we've talked about what this is really about. We've talked about why organizations are thinking about it. How do you assess yourself?
Mm,
How do you start looking at the things that are important? What are the things you should start looking at? And I kind of started already digging into this a little bit.
yeah.
I would say thing number one is you need to look at, are we adopting containers yet or not?
Mm,
And these are even, we're going to, at the end of this, we're going to have some homework questions for you guys to have, things that I want you to take away and start thinking about. Because when we do our next session, I want you guys to bring your answers back. And I want to make this an organic conversation where we can walk through the things that you guys have thought about, took some information down about, and let's start diving into how we can see if you're ready or if you're not quite there yet, or maybe you're ready, but there's some other steps you got to go through. Let's have a conversation about that. So just level setting that is where we're going to go towards the end of this conversation. So be prepared for that. Um, Christian, before I dig into too much of the how, I want to ask you, is there anything that you want to add into the what around OpenShift and OpenShift?
Yeah, I think I think is the a lot of the times it's also you mentioned scary, right? You fear what you don't understand, right? And
Absolutely.
I think that's what I see a lot of that happening too. That there's some fear over going to a completely new UI. That alone, right? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
managing my infrastructure on this UI that I know if I click here it does this. I know if I click here it does this. I know where to go to troubleshoot and so on and so forth. So I think the fear of something new has always, is something that's always there. But I think if we're able to overcome that, there's all this new way of doing things that it happened to me that I didn't realize, right? Until I started learning about containers and about the new architectures and about all this new technology.
Sure.
I think if we see what the open source community is doing, it's just bringing so much innovation, and it continues to happen, right? I mean, there's this innovation
Absolutely.
coming from artificial intelligence, machine learning, right? And I think containers, right, microservices, and this is all coming from the open source community. So I think that fear can be overcome by belonging to a community, right? And being part of a
Sure.
community. And it can be a community within the organization that you are part of that you can even form, right? You can even form a group of those interested in learning and then form a community and then bring partners to the conversation like Shadowsoft to be able to just have that conversation, to be able
Yeah.
to help you and be part of that community. There's all these community events that are happening, but I think that helps a lot with overcoming that fear that sometimes we feel with some learning something new.
Yeah. And the reality is it's not more complicated. It's just different.
Yeah, that is true.
Right? Like that's the biggest thing that I learned going into this. Now, some of the people that are on this call today, I know already have OpenShift. They're using it, but they're not using OpenShift for it.
Hmm.
Sean and Raymond's team, I know specifically has OpenShift, but they're not using OpenShift for it. Right. So just to dig into that a little bit, I'm going to go into how OpenShift Vert works before we dig into this, because I think it's important that you guys understand some of this stuff. So I briefly mentioned before OpenShift Vert it's based on a project called KubeVirt. That's the open source project. The way it fundamentally works is a pod is generated. That pod runs a small containerized instance of KVM, so kernel virtualization, and then it spins up your VM inside of it. In doing so, it gets access to all the other things that OpenShift would normally have for a pod, meaning horizontal pod autoscalers, software-defined storage, software-defined networking, kind of like I alluded to before. How you manage it is through different CRDs. So for those who are not, Kubernetes OpenShift people, there's an object type for OpenShift Vert. You create a vert object, and it's just like you would expect. It would have memory, CPU allocation, what's the root disk, etc. You're not managing it like you would manage a pod. But underneath the hood, if you go into OpenShift, you can see that pod running. So effectively, that's how the technology works underneath the hood. And it makes a lot of sense that Kubernetes and OpenShift through Red Hat would adopt that because, again, it lets them have the benefit of everything else. With that comes some nuances. Many people will go, okay, I'm used to the VMware world. How does things like software defined storage work in this environment? Software defined storage, and not even software defined storage, but storage in general, is something that is a little bit unique. Every provider has different layers of support and what they can do out of the box in terms of supporting OpenShift Vert for VM live migrations and things like that, right? If you are a Pure shop or a Dell shop or something like that, we would highly, highly, highly recommend using a software-defined storage solution. There's Red Hat ODF, there's Portworx by Pure, there's a couple of different ones, and that gives you software-defined storage replication in the cluster. It gives you the ability to do live migrations. Essentially, think of it as the equivalent of vSAN inside of VMware, right? If you have some other storage providers like NetApp, there is some plugins with like the ONTAP Trident driver that lets you be able to leverage some of their storage array more directly. But there's different options there. So this is something that you're going to want to have a deeper level of conversation around with your Red Hat rep or with somebody like us before you go forward with anything, because we want to make sure we right size and make sure you have the right technology in front of you, right? Effectively, though, everything works pretty similar in terms of network layout topology. We can use trunking for NICs, for VLANs, for virtual networks inside of your environments. All of the regular communication for the cluster goes over the management interface, which can be bonded. So you have a couple of different things you'll want to consider. I could spend all day unpacking the complexities of OpenShift Vert for you. But what's important that you guys have as a takeaway today is, how do I assess my environment? The way that that begins, most importantly, you got to look at some kind of like bare basic stuff. First of all, what's your automation stack? I think that that is something that quite frankly gets overlooked way too frequently. And it's something that is really important, both for the purposes of identifying what are the lifts you're going to have to make, but also, is this actually going to make your life better right out of the gate immediately, where you're doing tool consolidation? You're saving costs because maybe you're paying a licensing fee for whatever automation stack you're using, or maybe it's something different. But that doesn't just end at the deployment tooling. It goes into things like what you're doing for disaster recovery and backup. Are you, for example, a Commvault shop? Well, they have something for OpenShift Vert, right? But not every solution out there, from traditional backup solutions, security solutions like antivirus, not a lot of traditional solutions just plug and play nicely. So you're going to have to look at things like, what are our in general stuff that we do for virtualization from tooling, and will they have to change? And that's something we can help interface with you guys, because again, it's nuanceical. There's differences depending upon what particular thing you're going to be leveraging. You also should be asking yourself, and Christian, I'm sure you can agree with this, what's your background? And I mean that, like, are you predominantly a Windows shop? Are you a Linux shop? This is a Linux world. A lot of it's abstracted away from you. But you're still going to want to understand the underpinnings of how this works. And I think that that begs the question of, if you are predominantly a Windows shop, don't fear not. You can run Windows workloads inside of OpenShift Vert. But what does your future look like? Are you trying to get to microservices that are going to live in containers? Because again, this is prompting you up to go that direction. Are you already in that direction where we're already using microservices? And again, we can tool consolidate and get things to be more fine granular. So that's the first thing you want to look at. The second thing you want to consider, and this is kind of a bread and butter obvious one, is what virtualization stack are you using? This whole time we've been talking about VMware, but they are not the only thing that is changing, disappearing, or having different kinds of things holding you back. There's Rev, which is sunset at this point. Red Hat is going full bore to OpenShift Vert. That's just the way it's going. If you're a Rev customer, we need to consider that. If you're an OpenStack user, are you public open source OpenStack? Are you a distributed version of OpenStack like Red Hat's distribution, or a different one? What version are you on? Right? Like, Are you on Yasmite or something? Like, what literal version of OpenStack are you on? Because some of these things will make your life very easy. If you're on a supported version of Red Hat OpenStack, we can use the Red Hat migration toolkit to move your VMs. If you're on Red, same thing. If you're on VMware 7 or later, same thing, right? But we can't necessarily do that for older versions of OpenStack, Hyper-V. And so we can still move your VMs, but it's going to be more of a process about how we go forth and do that, mirroring your workloads bit for bit and using some different tooling in place. So you're going to want to understand, obviously, what's that look like. Um, there's kind of also the obvious question of what are your workloads that you're virtualizing today? But maybe that's not so obvious. I mean, Christian, when I ask you that question, why do you think I'm bringing that up?
Well, I think, I was going to just add there that sometimes we miss out on the opportunity to modernize very easy to modernize applications, right? Sometimes we have applications that are running on a lot of VMs, right?
Yeah.
Maybe web servers and all this stuff that are supporting this application. We could modernize it into a container, right? So I don't know if that,
Yeah. Yeah.
that will be one of those, where you consider what applications am I running here that could be containerized. And listen, not all of the applications will be able to be containerized right now, and that's okay. You can containerize the ones that can, and the ones that you can't do it right now, bring them as a VM, you know?
Right. Right. Absolutely. And some things work well in that way, and some things are a little bit more complicated because this has more to do with future state.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I mean double future state. So let's think of it as two stages, going to OpenShift Vert, and then stage two would be containerizing workloads that are in OpenShift Vert
Right.
to make it use it more effectively, right? OpenShift Vert, we can just move your VMs. You got databases, you have, monolithic workloads, we can put it in OpenShift Vert. But long term, what's going to make you most effective, especially when it comes to rolling restarts, highly scalability, right? To be able to heal quickly because you can have health checks on your workloads, you're going to want to get to containers for that, but not everything just fits for that. So, for example, do you want to put Microsoft SQL in a container? You can, but is it smart to do so? There's a lot of nuance there. The first thing being, and I'll just be quite honest with you, Microsoft SQL, Postgres, MariaDB, MySQL, they are not designed for a containerized world. So usually you have to run one container, one pod of that thing, which can survive and restart itself great, but you can't run it highly available where you have multiple pod instances running in most circumstances. This is where distributed SQL like CockroachDB comes into play, or NoSQL databases like Mongo, Cassandra, things that are distributed make a lot more sense. So you want to understand what type of workloads you're moving, predominantly not just for the virtualization, but then in the future to if you're going to containerize, what that roadmap might look like. Because ultimately, you may go before we even turn it into a containerized workload, maybe we're going to refactor it, right? I'm going to throw you a curveball because I'm interested on why you think I'm going to ask this, but this is a really important one in my opinion. Christian, why do you think I would ask? How is your team organizationally divided, like dev, ops, SRE, etc.?
Okay. I think is a lot to do with the collaboration, because sometimes there's a lot of
Mm.
silos in many organizations,
Mhm.
and that can make things very, very hard when you're trying to modernize to add new technology. I think that if they're segmented, if there are silos within the organization, it's going to be a lot harder to really move forward together. So I think that should be addressed. It should be assessed. The current state of your silos, right? I guess you can say,
Sure.
and then address that too. And that could be part of that modernization. We're implementing new processes that are going to help us come together, hash it out together, figure out what the problem is, and solve that problem so that we can collaborate. Collaboration is a big key.
So 100% it's partly about that. The other part about it is though is change control management.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to what I talked about earlier. So let me give you an example. It's not about identifying where there's necessarily silos, because there's going to be silos effectively no matter what
Sure.
organization you're in. We can try and dodge them all they want. They happen, right? But the reality is understanding how you're divided, because that might change how you adopt something like OpenShift from change control management. Because
True.
again, you could have in one organization DevOps, and security. That could be the way your organization is built. You could also be kind of one of those companies that has multiple acquisitions and there's multiple dev groups, multiple op groups. There could be an SRE team and they could be shared resources across different groups, right? You could have an enterprise architect team, for example. Depending upon, and I mean, you can have network ops, right? All different types of things. But depending upon how you're divided, it's going to change ultimately how you adopt change control management. And I think that's almost the most crucial thing when it comes to OpenShift and OpenShift Vert that needs to be considered early. It doesn't have to happen before you start adopting, but it needs to be addressed in early adoption phases to not create bad habits. There's reasons for this. The first thing is when you adopt OpenShift Vert, again, everything is software defined. So if people are making network policy changes to their workloads, what VM can talk to what VM, that might break a security rule. Is the security team even going to be aware of changes that are going in the environment? Do they even care? Or do they go, as an organization, we're going to say the risk is mitigated for managing the security network topology of this environment because it's really on DevOps and we're really more about moating, like putting a moat around OpenShift. Some people treat it that way. Some people will go, nope, every little thing that changes in OpenShift because we have to be, FIPS compliant, we have to be SOX compliant, etc. We need to wall off every little thing. And so lots of third-party tools get integrated. They need to be involved in every decision, which means really locking down the environment. Users are only allowed to provision things from a service account rather than manually provision things, even in lower environments like dev and test, that could be the case. The way you issue storage could also be a thing, not even from a security perspective, just because software defined storage, anyone can go grab it. There's a limit on how much storage there is physically. So
Yeah.
who's in charge of managing the life cycle of all the storage that the OpenShift cluster has, and how do you divvy up quotas to different groups, right? Thinking about this as well, maybe you're a large organization, you need to do chargeback. How are you going to do chargeback? There's tools like KubeCost that give you the ability to do that, including across OpenShift Vert and VMs. But you want to implement that early because if you have to integrate that down the road, it's going to change the way you approach everything. So for me, the way that we normally do assessments is we usually have like several weeks where we'll work with a customer to kind of go through. This is just for OpenShift in general, let alone OpenShift for architecture, security, network ops, what applications are you deploying, etc. All I'm saying for right now is figure out how your organization is divided. Are you DevOps and SRE and it's shared across the whole org? Is it we have different silos because we're a bank and like app A has its own dev team, its own ops team, its own SRE team, and they feed up to a larger group. Understanding those communication patterns, and this is where you said communication earlier, is very, very, very important because that's what's going to instill how change control management gets driven, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day. So the things we've talked about thus far, just to kind of recap, because I don't want us to get lost in the noise, in terms of the how and how you're going to assess your environment. What's your virtualization stack? What's your tooling around the environment? Again, automation, security, DevOps, I'm sorry, not DevOps, disaster recovery, backup, things like that. How is your team organized? What types of workloads are you currently running? And I think I glossed over this, but it needs to be really hammered in on. Are you using containers today?
Mhm.
Whether it be on Kubernetes or not, right? It could be just, containers running in Docker. It could be Docker Swarm. Hopefully not. Not for any reason other than I really don't like Docker Swarm. Is it Kubernetes? If so, is it OpenShift? Is it a different distro? Yeah, you can laugh out loud about that, Raymond. I really don't like Docker Swarm. Because and like even if you are using containers, is it a silo like a small group's doing it? Is it more an organizational practice? And this is probably the last one. What's your organizational strategy for buying to this? Are they get off VMware at all means necessary? Are they we need to transform our business and VMware is just a part of that? What is the strategy behind your business? Because you could have all the things met. That this makes a perfect sense. We fit like a glove into going through this. But if your organization's like, we've used VMware for 80 years and we're never getting off VMware, well, then maybe we approach this from a different angle of let's start with your containerized workloads and then approach VM when you feel comfortable with it.
Mhm.
So I call it the top five. Those are the 5 things I would initially look at to start assessing your environment. And then as time goes on, I would start to consider what are the next phases after that. And I think I mentioned this as well, but I'll just again to recap, maybe this would be a number 6. What's your storage? I didn't really mention it in terms of the how, but I think you do need to look at that. What's my storage provider? What are we doing there? What do our storage requirements look like? Because that will affect how we end up doing certain things. So I want to pause for a second. You and I, especially me, I've talked a tremendous amount. I want to open the door to the audience a little more. Sean, Raymond, Michael, I see Justin joined. Everyone that's in the lobby, do you guys have general questions or thoughts or things you're interested in talking about? We're going to open up the gate so you guys can just unmute yourself and just ask, because I want this to be collaborative. Go ahead, Sean. I see you unmuted.
Don't open that Pandora's box.
I gotta do it.
Okay, we're just so that the group knows, we're at the beginnings of doing, well, I said the beginnings. We've been looking at for the past 6 months. How do we move? How do we transition?
Yeah.
My first thoughts are, how do I get the 30-second lift pitch to senior management? What are the key factors in order to get them on board? I know the technicals on why it's better,
Sure.
but the sales pitch on why it's a better approach. One
Okay.
thing I love, we did the 3 weeks ago, we did the Red Hat hands-on session where we did the
Okay.
open vert and walk through doing an actual VMware migration and what
Cool.
all happened. So it was very eye-opening on a lot of what happened. One thing that really caught my attention that you kind of pointed out, maybe even glossed over, that to me was a big factor: the legacy stuff that you would run on the KubeVirt environment for VMs that get treated as containers, you get that same functionality. So from a
Yeah.
route perspective, I can loop in security policies. I can loop in the traffic routing circuit breaker policies in Kubernetes with those legacy VMs. To me, that was awesome.
Dude, that's a really good point. I didn't even touch on is service mesh, because most people don't even think about the service mesh. They think about API gateways or API management. You can use service mesh for containers, which is Istio, but now you can use it on VMs. So you can do, you're just to your point, circuit breaking across VMs for when you have 2 different versions of something deployed. Like, it's such an awesome thing that you can tap into that it's like, it's one of those things you have to go a step deeper. If you're somebody who's in OpenShift, which you guys are, you get that. And I love that you get that, because it's a really cool facet of capabilities that there's just no way you can do it in any other environment except going this direction. So to answer your question, though, I hate to say it this way, but it depends. And I want to ask a question to answer your question, which is, what does your leadership care about? That's the reason why it depends. If your leadership cares about the financial side of it, there's a way of architecting the conversation piece. But if they care more about, it's not really the finances so much, it's really more about transforming your business to be more highly scalable, it looks different. So like the way I would word this would be entirely different. So Sean, please, what do you think they care about most? Security, finances, transformation, what is it?
Finances is the obvious one, but I think that's a secondary, because when you start looking at long-term cost of things, it starts to pan out a little bit, especially as we look at things like we've got tons of VMs. Well, what's the VM doing? Oh, it's only hosting this one service. Why do we need a whole big VM carving up lots of resources and compute? I can go down to a tiny little container and
That's true.
I just bought a lot of compute back. So if I can do that a lot over time, then I don't have to have as much hardware to back everything. So
For
that
sure.
helps. But long term, I mean, we're aiming toward everything is container driven. Right
Sure.
now, we've got legacy where there's a lot of stuff not container, but you look at a 2-3 year plan, try to get out of that environment and move everything to containers. So it makes it
Sure.
a lot easier to move things. So I think, to answer your question, they're more focused on what can we do with the platform as opposed to what the cost is. Security is obvious. We got to do things.
I love that. Okay, so most companies are focused on the finances, so I'm glad you made that clarity, because otherwise I might have painted the picture very differently. The first thing I'd say is painting the picture of tool consolidation, whether for cost reasons or not, I think is extremely important, because it changes the way that your team is trained. So as an operational group, you have to do things one way for VMs right now and something completely different for containers. You don't have a GitOps workflow for VMs. You might for the content inside of a VM, but not for the VM itself. Just using that as an example, right?
Yep.
So I think it's important to hammer in on, if we do this, this limits the amount of tools that we have, so we can get rid of some things, which is also a cost savings to us. Not that it really is the primary focus, but it lends credence to our team will be more effectively trained because everything is in OpenShift. So that creates a greater birth of adoption. With greater birth of adoption calls more opportunities to learn new skill sets in the platform itself. So we glossed over service mesh, but using that to a higher level of a degree, bringing in things like virtual pod or horizontal pod auto scaling, and bringing that into the capacity of auto scaling workloads, that's another huge gain. I mean, not to mention the fact, if you want to do things like intrusion detection at scale, you can, besides putting something in a VM, you can now be monitoring what's entering in your VM, what's entering in your containers, all from the same environment, and do network-based control from a software-defined way. So to me, from a security perspective, this makes a lot more sense, because now I go, I only want this container to talk to this VM and nothing else. And I can do that in a network policy inside of OpenShift. Whereas before, someone had to adjust firewall rules. They're really looking at OpenShift as a big thing by itself. And when it egresses out of OpenShift, now we got to manage how that connectivity goes across the line. Now you can get real fine granular with policy management across things from a security perspective. So there's that angle as well. I mean, it's kind of sky's the limit, honestly, in terms of different features you can start dabbling into.
The network thing that you just mentioned, I think, is a big one, because we're going through that now, where the legacy systems and having to go through and jump through the hoops of, okay, a security tool has to do something, the network policy has to do something, all in order to link things together.
I got the next one. Next one. Go. Yo, finish.
No. That was the main point. Is we're going through that growing pain right now.
I'm going to hit you with my most important thing that I've been talking about recently. I've been writing a lot of blogs about it. We've been posting a lot about it. This is an idea that we came up with in the last year and a half. It's just a concept, but there's nothing wrong with this concept, because it's just leveraging the tools the way that they were inadvertently designed to be, which is OpenShift, if everything is inside of it, brings the birth to infrastructure agility. And what I mean by that is OpenShift is the same on-premise as it is in VMware, bare metal or not bare metal, as it is in the cloud. If you decide the infrastructure here is too expensive, I want to run it in AWS bare metal, or maybe, we want to do, for high availability reasons, run everything in AWS bare metal and also on premise. Or maybe we want to be multi-cloud, but we don't want to have to learn new tools for every cloud provider. Well, now you only have to learn how to spin up OpenShift in those different cloud providers, and including Knative for Lambda-like functions, CockroachDB, Mongo for, shared services that are databases that are running like databases as a service in your environment. You effectively have the same cloud in a box everywhere. So now you can get to the point where if you have to move, it's just pointed at a different cluster. And furthermore, you can have either OpenShift ADPI replicate workloads between environments, or you can have something like Portworx, which does synchronous replication if you're close enough in proximity network-wise to mirror your storage in real time between different OpenShift clusters. So now you can have hot availability across different geographically dispersed environments, and every tooling be exactly the same. So you open a door, if you go, we're going to put everything in OpenShift, virtual machines, containers, everything, to being able to run everything the same everywhere and move on a dime. So that's the bigger pitch. If you really want to get them on the pitch, that's probably the way that I would lean.
That one just triggered an idea of, we're looking at internationalization and having to tackle the where to run platform wise, because you get the legalities of where you can run things. So
yep.
That use makes OpenShift it very as the
least. Yep, you use OpenShift as the least common denominator, because an operating system can go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And then you just automate the infrastructure setup of the OpenShift cluster, and you're done. It's compelling. This is what I keep telling people, is that When people look at Kubernetes as a solution for containers, they're like, it's a platform containers. I'm like, you are shrinking the value of Kubernetes to such a large degree. And I just had a conversation with someone because they said, well, why not just use vanilla Kubernetes? Kubernetes is getting commoditized. And my response to them was, because you're going to want support for ingress, for storage, for the network topology layer, for your single sign-on platforms, like if you're going to use Keycloak, right? For service mesh, for all these different components. And do you really want to go to 50 different vendors, or do you want to go to one vendor that's pre-integrated all of it, that's going to provide support for all of it? I mean, and at the end of the day, if you're like, well, okay, I could do all that, but I don't want to be married to OpenShift, no problem. Just use the Kubernetes APIs inside of OpenShift. And then you're still getting support for all of it. Like, it's such a panacea of a good idea. Like, it blows my mind that people are just kind of missing the boat on what the real value of this is, which is infrastructure agility, in my opinion. But that's my own concept, so of course I'm gonna like it. It's... Christian, do you have anything you want to add? You're on mute. You're on mute, buddy.
All right. So sorry about that. So
No, you're good.
just one thing that I wanted to add. I think this conversation has been very, very interesting, to hear the different perspectives, even from customers and such. And I think that I am passionate about our partners, right? And I love that I'm doing here this with you, Derek, today. And I
Yeah,
think that is it's all about strategy, right? So when you're talking about people that get it at an organization that understand the value and how to bring it to leadership, how to bring it to the whole team, the whole organization. I think that's when you can partner up with Derek, right? With Shadowsoft, where you guys can bring them into the conversation, strategize a great conversation so that you guys can bring it to leadership, right? And bring the
absolutely.
value that they can bring, not just from the technology perspective, but also from the partnership perspective. Because when you bring a partner in, it becomes much easier than just doing it alone, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of value in that.
Appreciate it, buddy. Guys, we're coming up on time, so I'm just gonna re-wrap up the questions that I think you guys should use as a takeaway. Now, remember, we're going to do another event in the next, Ross, is it 2 weeks, 3 weeks? Correct me if I'm wrong. 3 weeks?
Yeah, 3 weeks time.
3 weeks. In 3 weeks, we're going to do another one of these as the follow-up masterclass section. And what I want to do is, if you guys come prepared with answers to those questions that I'm going to give you, we'll have time at the end to walk through them and kind of get like a Q&A session on, oh, because of these situations, what would you recommend? And like have a nice dialogue around it. So again, what are the questions? What's your virtualization stack, first and foremost? Secondly, how is your organization team divided? Thirdly, what type of workloads are you running? Fourthly, are you using containers or Kubernetes or some kind of platform like that today? If so, how is it being implemented? Number five, what automation and just tooling around your virtualization are you using today? Ansible, Terraform, Commvault for DR, CrowdStrike for cybersecurity, whatever. And last, what's your storage provider? That would be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for joining. Christian, thank you so much for participating and being a part of the conversation. I really appreciate the time. This is just fun for me, so I love doing these.
Yeah, same here. Thank you so much for the opportunity in the time.
Absolutely. Sean, Raymond, Justin, Michael, and everyone else on the line, it was great talking to all of you. We will catch you in the next session in 3 weeks. Till now, see you guys. Bye, everybody.